Welcome, everyone. We are going to begin with a land acknowledgement. Please join me in a deep breath. San Diego Mesa College is built on the ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay people. We acknowledge and honor their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship, past, present, and future. We also want to honor the legacy of the African diaspora, Black life, and the free enslaved labor which this country was built upon. We acknowledge, protect, and uplift the humanity of our Indigenous and Black sisters and brothers. With this acknowledgement, we want to give honor through our work and continue to stand up for racial and social justice. If you would like to see Mesa College's Restorative Action Plan, please click the link provided in the chat. Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. My name is Wendy Smith, and I am one of the facilitators for today's event, which is being recorded to share with those who are unable to attend. Please fill out our survey. The link is in the chat. This helps us learn more about our audience and improve what we do. I teach English 101 courses with the theme of ethnography and ethnographic writing. It's more important than ever that students immerse themselves in communities, both familiar and unfamiliar. Qualitative research is relevant to life and career because it prioritizes lived experience, observational powers, and diverse perspectives. For students, this is a chance to think deeply about their communities and to demonstrate their own expertise. Many thanks to my inspirational co-creator, Katlin Choi, who suggested this series. Today, we are excited to present our speaker, Dr. Cheryl Ching, Professor of Leadership in Education at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Shall we get started?
All right, so it's 4 o'clock where I am, so I think it's afternoon for everyone, hopefully on the screen. I'm really excited to be with you, even though I'm not physically in Southern California. I lived there for several years while I was a graduate student, and I miss it most days, especially when it's almost winter and it's getting quite cold where we are. So I just have like a couple of slides to walk through. Please, at any point, just stop, raise your hand, ask a question, put a question in the chat, and I'll happy to sort of respond as they come up. I want to thank Wendy and Katlin for inviting me to be part of this series, as well as to be with you today. And I just thought, like, I kind of wish as an undergrad, I had a chance to engage in ethnographic research, or at least learn about it. Like, it was a word I knew about, but I didn't take any anthropology classes. Frankly, I didn't do much research of the kind that I do now when I was an undergrad, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about myself and my own journeys, mainly because I believe that, sort of maybe not every, but a lot of facets of your personal life kind of make its way into any research project, both explicitly as well as implicitly. And I think one of the things as qualitative researchers is to be kind of aware of that, cognizant of that, and to know how it moves through both your research process and your research products. And it's not something to like put in a box, but it's something to be aware of and to acknowledge. So I can get this right and share my screen. If I'm allowed to do that, I will jump right into some of my slides. So I've sort of like organized my comments around my dissertation research, and I'll talk about like how I got to the research questions that I was interested in engaging, at least at the time. Gosh, I think now it's like about 5, 6, 7 years ago. These are questions I'm still very much interested in, but at the time I did need a dissertation study, and this is the one that emerged as the one that I was most fascinated about. And again, I'll talk about how I got to that question. But like in a nutshell, I was really interested in how higher education practitioners make meaning of a word like equity, both as a word, as a set of ideas, kind of in theory, as well as in practice. And there were reasons why I situated this study and thought it made most sense to interrogate this question at a community college. So just like a little bit about me, and again, just in ways that kind of reflect like how who I am and the experiences I've had inform the kinds of research questions that interest me, intrigue me, motivate me, make me want to do research going forward in life. So I'm originally from the Philippines. It is still home to me. It is where I was born, I was raised. It is where my immediate family currently resides. So while I do live in what is now known as the United States, like the Philippines remains my homeland. And so growing up, and I lived there until I was 18. I came to college, when I was 18. I attended what was called, and it was still called, the International School, and before that it was called the American School. And for those of you who know, like the Philippines was a colony, was colonized by the United States for a short period of time, by the Spanish before that for a much longer period of time, and in between the wars by the Japanese for like 5, 7 or so years. But at the time when the Americans were around and sort of the governing body, they created for American personnel something called the American School, which eventually became the International School. So that was the school I attended. And so diversity was kind of the lifeblood of the school, I would say. And so I kind of note that because, diversity, equity, inclusion are often these words that kind of get lumped together. But I think as I've grown, I've sort of learned, what the distinctions and differences between these words are. But with what I know now, I kind of look back and I think like, yeah, I was very much aware of, racial diversity to some extent, certainly ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, and all of those things. Also, I was very much aware growing up in the Philippines, which, by terms like developmental economists would say it's sort of a developing country. The old word used to be third world country, all of these things. It is a country where class and economic inequalities are quite distinct. It's quite, it's quite a stratified society. So again, you can't live in the Philippines, you can't live in Manila without noticing inequality as a daily factor of everyday life. It's a very visceral experience. So these are things that were just, as I was growing up, these were things that I was aware of. I eventually learned the immense amount of privilege I had attending this school and what it then allowed me to do, meaning like that I could come to the United States for college, and that I could go to, what was, kind of quote, a selective school and do well at this school. So these are things I didn't really know then, like as an 18-year-old or as a 16-year-old, like when I was in high school. But there are things when I look back, I now know them. Like I'm now very much aware of that. So I went to college, and I went to Wellesley College, which is actually not very far from where I currently work. And there I actually entered as an English major because I thought I wanted to earn an English PhD. And I think I learned quite quickly there that, while I did like literature and I did like analyzing literature, I liked the process of it. Frankly, I wasn't very good at it because then I noticed that there were many other folks like in my classes who often had what seemed to me much more insightful things to say about the poem or the short story or the novel. And I think at some point I probably went too hard on English classes in my first couple of years. And I actually kind of got a little like, I think I need to kind of venture out some more. So I actually started taking more social science classes and sociology and history in particular. And so I never majored in one of those. I never switched my major out of English. And in fact, I took a lot of my kind of literary analytic skills into those subjects. But I started dabbling into social science and getting a view of what that world is like. And I make a comment around that because the field that I now work in and what I got my doctorate in, higher education, is kind of considered a social science field. And so you can kind of see that there are these little sort of breadcrumbs that were already forming, even though it took me actually quite a few years before I then went to graduate school to earn my doctorate. So after Wellesley, I worked a little bit. I then got a master's in what is called humanities and social thought. So again, kind of getting a little deeper into the social sciences. But it was actually the job that I had after that master's at a philanthropy, like at a grant-making organization in New York City called the Teagle Foundation, that I learned about higher education as a kind of, as an organization, like as a space for change and reform, about how it's organized, as well as I learned a whole lot more about how inequalities are shaped within the United States and specifically within New York City. And so while I was at the foundation, I was the program officer for a program that was basically a college access program in kind of education terms, like that's what it would be called. But the idea around that program was to connect community organizations working with students who attended the New York City public schools with colleges, and really kind of providing students with a glimpse into what it would actually be like to be in a college classroom. And there was a kind of focus around liberal education and liberal arts education. So it was sort of like creating like bridge programs, creating semester-long programs, in which in some cases, like some of the students also had opportunities to do research around their communities. So it was sort of like basically kind of creating like this college experience for students who may be attending schools where that just wasn't part of their curriculum. And so one of the things that made clear to me, whereas, and I'll eventually talk about this, like the way the foundation had sort of framed access and opportunity and inequities was really, again, around socioeconomics and not really around race. Though for those of you who have been to New York City, who've watched movies about New York City, we know that is a city that is very racially diverse, and that it's stratified along economic as well as racial lines. And so these things were implicit at that point when I was a program officer. And then they became much more explicit once I then went to graduate school at the University of Southern California, which is a couple of hours from San Diego. And there I worked at a center called the Center for Urban Education, and worked with a scholar named Dr. Estella Ben-Simon. And I think it was really at USC where I learned a number of things, both, again, how I think like race is constituted in this country, how it's constructed in this country, and how that construction then leads to material effects. So we can call it under the umbrella of racism, we can call it under the umbrella of whiteness, we can call it under the umbrella of a lot of things, but that is kind of quite foundational to the way inequities materialize in this country, persist in this country, and why it makes efforts towards deep transformation quite difficult. So I learned that while I was at SC. I also learned I actually then learned how to do like research, like, kind of in a sort of structured and formal way. And so that's why I have a note here how I think in graduate school, they sort of like say, like, take as many, like the advice that we were given was, yeah, sure, take all the content classes that are important, like for what you want to study, but really take as many methods classes as you can, because part of what you're trying to learn, certainly in a doctoral program, is definitely becoming a so-called expert in a specific area of study. But it's really about developing a kind of research way of thinking into those topics. And so coming in, I did some historical research. Again, I did all this literary analysis, like when I was an undergrad, but I really hadn't had any formal training. Like, I never took a stats class. I ran away from the econ classes. I took like the bare minimum of math classes I could take. And then I didn't even know what qualitative research was. Like I knew what archival research was, but I didn't really know what qualitative research was. And so I took all the classes. Like, so I took all the quant classes, I took all the qual classes, we didn't have a mixed methods class, so we didn't do that. But I think in taking those classes, like I started to learn that there were particular things that really just sort of jived with how I not only saw the world, but also how I made sense of it and how I wanted to learn more about it. And so the kind of fancy word that academics often use is that, you know, there's like something at an epistemological level. It's like, how do you know what you know? And so one of the things that really resonated with me, and I know Wendy sort of mentioned this about qualitative research, was exactly that. Like I was really interested in human interactions. I was interested in the language that people used. I was interested in how people make sense of the world around them. And I totally value like quantitative work. I very much value mixed methods work. I'm actually on a team, a mixed methods team, but I do none of like the quant work. But then like there are folks who really think quantitatively who are on that team. And so we come together around like a particular set of issues and investigate that. So I see a lot of value in that. Like I'm not one of those researchers like, oh my gosh, like quant is the devil. We don't want that. Like that's not how research should be done. I see that there's value in all forms of knowledge creation, both inside and outside universities and the academy. But for me, it just felt really right, like learning by talking to people, learning by observing people and observing spaces, by reading documents, like that just felt very kind of natural to me. But again, I mean, I think there are kind of breadcrumbs from like earlier parts of my life, like where I like words, right? You know, so like there is some kind of like there to who you become from who you were before. So I did that. I did my dissertation research. We'll get into that a lot in the next couple slides. And I'm currently now an assistant professor, like at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And I have a note here where I continue to learn about doing research. I mean, I think there's a sort of false belief that like once you have your PhD, you kind of know how to do research. It's like, yes, you do. You've been through it a couple of times. But it's like every project raises a set of questions or a set of challenges or a set of opportunities that you then, you know, have to confront, have to respond to, have to address in some ways. And so it's sort of like with every new project, I just kind of deepen my skills and my knowledge. Like it makes me think twice about things I did in the past. And so, again, it's always this kind of state of becoming, I feel, as a researcher, and certainly as a qualitative researcher, I'll say that. And I would even say as a quant researcher, being on this team gives me an insight into like how quant scholars kind of also wrestle with very similar decision-making points, at least with the folks that I work with. So I'm really appreciative that I work with quant folks who are very thoughtful about their model building and like how they construct variables and how like what analyses they're able to do given the data that they have. And the other thing that I'm sort of in the process of becoming and always is that, you know, for the first time in my life, I'm actually working in higher ed. So I'm someone who studies higher ed, but prior to this job, I never actually worked in higher education. I was sort of always on the sidelines. And so this job has afforded me an opportunity to look inside the university from the inside rather than just from the outside. And so, yeah, it's been a fascinating journey, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that as well. So I'm going to just stop for a minute. I'm going to check the chat, or someone can just yell out to me if like there's some question that I should address at this point before I go on to the next slide.
Would anyone like to ask a quick question before we move on? I have one quick one.
Sure.
Okay, so you're on a mixed methods team right now. Does that team have a current project? Or
Yes,
am I
so
anticipating something?
yeah. So we have a project we just, I guess, wrapped up in terms of like the grant funding has ended, but it hasn't wrapped up in that we're, you know, analyzing data and writing papers and doing presentations and stuff. And then we've started a new project. So I can talk about both of those. So are folks in the room, I mean, must be familiar with Assembly Bill 705. So a lot of my research still takes place in California. I think all of my research still takes place in California, and both in the community colleges and elsewhere. So so Assembly Bill 705, which essentially, and now with 1705, is effectively eliminating developmental education. So I was part of a research team that was studying the implementation of it in Los Angeles, like in LACCD in that district. And it was part of it's a project organized around a research practice partnership. So we were working with the district to examine the implementation of that policy at the district level, as well as doing a deeper qualitative dive into 3 of the colleges like within that district. So that's the project that is sort of wrapped up in terms of the funding, and so we're now in the process of writing papers, presenting, and doing all that fun stuff. The new project, the current project, is sort of an outgrowth of that. And this, I think this I find really fascinating. The qual piece of that is actually a bit smaller than the quant piece of it. And so one of the things that came out of the 705 project is that, and this is less a question on the English side than on the math side, where, one of the responses was to develop kind of statistics and liberal arts math pathways, and one was to develop like the kind of algebraic calculus pathways, like business STEM math pathways. And so one of the things that we started, or the quant people started seeing in from the analyses, was that there might have been some kind of tracking that was going on in terms of who was selecting, being counseled into whatever, being placed into whether it was the SLAM pathway, the statistics pathway, or the calculus, like algebra pathway. And so there was some evidence from the data that that tracking might have been racialized in some way. And so with the new project, one of the things, like, that's the kind of starting point. And so the project is organized around, like, how do we essentially create a bridge between the 2 pathways? So like, if I was a student and I was told, I just kind of want to get my math requirement out of the way. I might have had some sort of aspirations, like for science, technology, education, engineering, math, like on the science side. But somehow in that very moment, I was just kind of like expressing that I wanted to kind of just get the math stuff out of the way. And so I was counseled to take like the SLAM pathway. The sort of hypothesis there is that might have cut off your eventual opportunities for STEM. And so are there things that at this one college that we're now working with, like, can they actually create a kind of way to go from SLAM to the STEM pathway pretty early on in the student's career, so that there isn't like time loss or anything, and that they can still continue onto like their STEM career path, like should they choose to do that down the line. So those are the kind of 2 projects that I've been on, and it's been with the same team, and it's been really kind of, I think, fascinating and really rewarding work. The 705 stuff has been interesting because we did much more sort of presentations out to the practitioners, like within LACCD. So and I think it was like through the time where it was sort of early implementation, and folks had lots of things to say about 705. So yeah, that was all good stuff. So those are kind of like the current projects that I'm on now. Any other questions before I go on?
Thank you for that.
Yeah, sure. Okay. All right. So kind of getting into the research stuff itself. It's like, why in the world was I interested in how people make meaning about equity? And so I have like kind of 4 bullet points here, and these are really kind of more notes for me, as well as they sort of capture like some of the reasons, both the personal as well as the research reasons, and the policy reasons, like why at least the way I argued why this question was important, which is something that you always have to do as a researcher. You have to like motivate the question, and you have to justify why you're studying. So I'm going to give you a sense of like why I thought this was important. So at the time I was in graduate school, and I was, again, like I knew very little about community colleges. Again, my trajectory was like, I was growing up in the Philippines where this kind of like 2-year community college model doesn't really exist. I mean, there are vocational technical schools that then kind of put you into the labor force pretty immediately after, or there are kind of 4-year baccalaureate research universities. Like, so this kind of community college model doesn't really exist. It's quite an American product in that way. And it sort of exists in other countries, but not at the scale that it exists, frankly, even in the state of California, where you have, I think the number keeps on changing, are you at 116 now? And then certainly across the country, there's many more community colleges. So I learned a lot more about community colleges, like once, I was in California and in graduate school. And one of the things that I was really intrigued about while I was in graduate school was the policy class that I took, like education policy. So it was in higher ed, it was in K-12, like, it was a kind of class that kind of ran through the entire sort of like education kind of spread. And it was looking at policy design, policy implementation. And so I was really intrigued about that. And I was always really kind of envious in some ways, because a lot of the readings that we had for that class were largely in the K-12 space. So like when you think largely around like education policy scholars, like they're largely folks who studied school districts, high schools, elementary schools, and that sort of thing. But I was like on the higher education track, like within my program. And I was like, where's all the policy implementation stuff around, like, in the higher ed space? And I learned very quickly that basically, kind of like, if you want to be a policy scholar, unless you want to study things like financial aid, like generally you're going to be working in a community college space, because community colleges are often on the receiving end of a lot of reforms and policies. And so one of the things that was happening at the time that I was in graduate school was this thing called the equity plans. And these were, I think I know there's some practitioners in the room, so this might be quite familiar to you. But for those of you who you're kind of like, what are these equity plans? It was essentially, literally, it was like a plan that each community college in the state had to develop, and they had to write down, like, where are there inequities in terms of outcomes like access and transfer in developmental education, progression, course completion. They had to identify where these inequities were in terms of outcome inequities, and then literally say, like, okay, here's what we're going to do to address it, and here are the things that we're going to be doing. So that was a time in which, this word, it's not that equity didn't exist before this policy. And frankly, it wasn't that the policy was new. The policy had been around since the kind of early to mid 90s. But what kind of made the difference, like in the mid 2000s, was that all of a sudden there was some money behind it. Like the state was actually going to fund it and fund colleges to actually put these plans into motion. So all of a sudden people were talking about equity like it was like the best thing since sliced bread. And so that was kind of the context in which this was happening. And so kind of circling back to my graduate school stuff, I actually thought that my dissertation was going to be around, I'm going to study the implementation of these equity plans, like maybe at a couple places, like do case studies, like of a couple schools, compare, contrast, and so that's kind of, and I actually started to do some work in that direction, meaning like reading the literature, kind of, developing some research designs, and I was kind of moving in that direction. And so I mentioned earlier that I worked at a place called the Center for Urban Education as a research assistant. And one of the things that I did as an RA at that center was, there was the kind of standard traditional research stuff that we were doing, like this dissertation study, like the ethnographies that the students in the class are doing. But then we also did a lot of kind of practitioner and college engagement using, kind of tools like of action research. to work with practitioners to actually identify problems of practice like within your own institution. So if you take, for example, actually Mesa was one of the colleges that the center had worked with, and I was staffed on this project. It was to like work with a group of what were called change agents. And I think, Wendy, you were one of the change agents. And it was to, identify like where inequities are happening, at the college, to investigate those using a lot of kind of ethnographic tools, to be honest, like talking with people, observing things, like doing document analysis, and then coming up with recommendations. And so sort of like at the same, so like while there was all of this reform stuff that was kind of happening in an external way, I actually got to see up front, like, how like folks at Mesa were like talking about equity. And this sort of kind of confirmed something for me that I observed in another study that I was doing actually out in Colorado, where it was kind of, that was like the first time it showed up, where I, like in an interview, I asked some math faculty around, just like, what is equity? Like, what does this mean to you? How do you think about it? And it was striking to me in that project that even within the same department, because this was at one college, one department, like folks had quite different things to say. Like there were some sort of like common threads underlying, but the kind of particularities of their responses were somewhat different. So I didn't really know what to make of it, other than, wow, people kind of think about this word in all sorts of ways. And so when I was at Mesa staffed on this project, I noticed the same thing. And so as I was thinking about, like, do I still want to do this policy implementation project, which basically would have, the way that project would have unfolded if I did it, would have been to kind of take, what is the design of the equity plan policy, and, whether and how did this college like implement the policy as set out by policy actors, like by these decision makers, by the legislature, by the system office. And so that would have been that project, which would have been, I think, a fine dissertation, hopefully. But then I realized, I'm like, I don't know if I really want to do that. And so for any student who's in the, in the room and, contemplating graduate school, contemplating a doctorate at some level, this is kind of standard advice, is like, the dissertation is going to be both, it's going to be like, it's a big project. It's an independent research project that you'll do, with your advisor, as a guide on the side, but it's kind of like your thing. So, so it's a lot of work, and I would say you'd have to be more than just interested. Like it would have to be a topic that, you'd want to kind of get up and do. And so while the policy implementation thing would have been fine, I was interested in it. There's some policy relevance. This question around like, why is it that people come to equity in different ways? And then more precisely, what happens then within a single organization where you have all of these different ways of thinking about one idea, one word? Like, how do you then come to some sense of what equity is for the whole, or at least some sense, some part of the whole at the very least? And so that was the thing I realized I was actually much more interested in. And so I kind of went in that direction. And so then I had to then I'm like, okay, well then I got to figure out again, one of the things that they make you do in a dissertation is like, you have to dive into the literature that's relevant for your study. And so I spent quite a long time reading about equity, or ideas, like even if it wasn't called equity, so things like access and opportunity and inequality, stratification, all of these things that are sort of related together, diversity, but specifically within the community college space. And so one of the things I also noticed from that is that, same as in practice, like even scholars had different configurations around what equity is, how they thought about it, how they study it. And there wasn't any real consensus. And so and also the other thing I noticed, that there weren't very many places where researchers were consistently defining how they were approaching equity. So I kind of used this word earlier, like outcome equities and outcome, inequities. That is one way of thinking about equity. It's a way that you can measure. So you'll take like outcomes like access or college completion or retention, these very typical like educational outcomes. And then you see like, who is achieving what and who is not. And then you kind of take the difference, and that represents an outcome inequity. But there are some people who don't, it's not that they don't think about equity or inequity in that way, but that's kind of the secondary, because that will then give you, that kind of tells you that something is not really working, right? Something's not really working for students, or they're not working for faculty, or they're not working for administrators or staff. And really kind of their kind of approach to equity is much more about like, we need to figure out why higher education is not working, for certain populations. And generally it, like they could be racial inequities, they can be gender inequities. And that gives us some way of kind of then interrogating, like, what are the norms of this place? Like, or what are some of the policies that are in place that might be creating those? And so their way towards equity is like, we really need to do some kind of transformative work, right? So it's not simply about closing certain gaps. Like, that's fine. That's great if that happens as a consequence of the work, but it's really about transforming, institutions so that they become more equity and justice oriented for particular groups of people. And so that was kind of all littered around like the scholarship. Like there were different ways, but like folks, at least in the kind of earlier generations of scholars, weren't that explicit about their definitions. And so thus I thought, I'm like, and I then tried to argue, at least in my dissertation, it's like, okay, so there is reason to study how people make meaning of equity, how they make meaning of it at an organizational level. Again, because there's this policy that has made equity really important. Again, because I've noticed from practice that like there are all these different ways of thinking about it. And that in the scholarship, there hasn't been a whole lot of work done to help us understand like how people sort of reconcile their different ways of meaning making for a kind of collective group. So that's what was happening, and that's how I ended up with, but ultimately it was really because like it's a question I wanted to answer for myself. And so I think that's generally, I would say that's generally where research should begin in an ideal way. It doesn't always happen that way, but if you can make it, it should start to begin, it begins there. And then you start to like kind of build both what you know, but also like how you might conduct the study as you engage, scholarship, as you engage, people who are on the ground, as you engage like the certain kind of environmental conditions that might make this particular topic salient at any point in time. So I see there's some things in the chat, so I'm gonna jump, okay. Yes, the change agent stuff. So any questions about getting to the topic or about any of the other things I've just talked about now? Okay.
Anyone have a question yet?
No questions?
Okay, maybe in a bit.
Okay, maybe in a bit. So I'm actually going to jump over the next slide because I kind of talked through that already. So kind of getting to the actual doing and the studying of this question that I was really interested in. So you make a lot of decisions as a researcher. And again, it's, I think ultimately I teach the qualitative research class here. And one of the things, at least I try to impress, and I hope I do it, is that ultimately it's like, it's your job as a researcher to not just make the decisions, but to justify those decisions in ways that will make others who may not be as invested in your question or your topic, certainly maybe not as interested, to make them invested and interested. And so it's kind of like your job, like that's where the writing becomes really important. That's where the kind of synthesis and analysis, all of that is as important as like the actual doing, meaning like the data collection piece of it, because I do think that, I mean, there are certain research topics and kind of social issues that kind of just speak for themselves, like as important. But there's some that aren't, and you do have to make an argument as to why not only this topic should be studied, but why you should study it in this way. So this kind of brings you to like the set of like, okay, I have to make certain decisions, and I have to be able to justify what all those are. And so these are just like what's on this slide is just a couple of the things that that I had to think about. I had to think about like, am I going to draw on particular theories or concepts or ideas to inform my research design, as well as inform some of my analysis and interpretation. I had to make a decision about research sites, and I'll sort of I'll kind of quickly talk about research sites. So at least for I would say for qualitative and quantitative, and thus for mixed methods works as well, you have no project if you have no access. And little access meaning like no person, no institution, no anything has to be involved in research, in anyone's research project. Like that's kind of like a fundamental rule of institutional review boards. You cannot coerce people into doing research. So basically, if no one says yes, you have no project. And that's why kind of determining research sites matters both in terms of it makes sense for your research questions. So, in kind of research terms, like it kind of meets your quote sampling criteria, but also like legitimate, like practical, at a practical level. It's like you can find 5 colleges or 5 schools or 5 whatevers that meets all the sampling criteria, but 4 of them say no. So you're left with the 1 that's going to say yes, and therefore your project moves in that direction. And I would say, particularly for qualitative work, it matters because the kind of goodness of your study, sometimes people like to use rigor, like the rigor of your study, the depth of your study will always depend on, again, how much, not just initial access that you get. Like someone says like, sure, you can spend some time with us, you can talk to folks, do whatever. So that's kind of the initial access that you would get. But then every person you ask, both can I talk to you, or can I observe your classroom, or can I observe your meeting? They don't have to say yes, because the person who said yes to you coming into the institution doesn't necessarily speak for them as well. And so I was really very lucky with my research site where I got the initial yes, you can do that. And a lot of people agreed to talk to me because if they didn't, then I wouldn't have been able to, I feel, to have had like as rich a picture as I was able to present like in my dissertation. So it's like at every point, like you're always negotiating access. And I would never assume that anyone should talk to me. So it's like, if they want to, then great, let's go. And if not, I'm going to move on to the next person or the next classroom, etc. I have like right in the middle, like case study or ethnography. So I know this class is around ethnography, and my study did use a lot of ethnographic methods. So like, I hung out a lot at the research site. Like I spent a year in the field. I attended a lot of meetings. Like I just like kind of sat around a lot of places, like kind of do this like ethnographic observation thing. And it was really important for me to do that because it mattered to me to understand like the culture of this place, the rhythm of this place, how life moves and shakes. And that was important because the theory that I used, which is something called sense making, sort of emphasized not just kind of what it would call like these sort of big events like within an organization that might impact how people think about or make meaning around some idea, but it also happens in kind of like day-to-day interactions and negotiations. And so kind of informed by that idea, I was like, oh, I have to like spend actually quite a lot of time at this place to kind of get a sense of like where equity was being talked about. Was it mostly formal, informal? Like, how are people talking about it? Like not in a here's an event and we're going to present all this stuff to you, but like how they were actually engaging it in kind of like in the everyday as they go about their lives. So I definitely used a lot of like ethnographic methods like as part of my data collection, but I really wrestled actually between like, am I going to do like a full-on ethnography, or I'm going to do this thing called a case study that utilized ethnographic methods. And in the end, like the way at least I presented and justified it in my dissertation was that I did a case study with these ethnographic methods. And it was sort of like slicing hairs a little bit. But one of the things, again, going back to graduate school, like one of the things that you have to do midway through your time there is that after you finish all your coursework, you do this thing called like a candidacy paper or a qualifying exam or a qualifying paper. And it's sort of like that milestone that then tells the faculty that you're ready to move on to like do a dissertation study. And so one of the questions I had to answer as part of my qualifying exam was like, what methods would I use to do a study like this? And so I spent a lot of time reading about case study. I spent a lot of time reading about ethnography, and I kind of split the difference and said, I'm going to do an ethnographic case study. And I think for me, I think the reason why I kind of shied away from the ethnography was mainly because like the culture piece was important, but it was in the service of like a kind of a different question around the kind of meaning making piece. Again, it was like literally I was like slicing hairs because I think I could have gone either way. And I was just much more intrigued by the way case study researchers write about case study, which again could be ethnographic, it could be a phenomenological case study. Like case study is kind of like the thing where it's like jack of all trades, Jill of all trades, like person of all trades. Like it could kind of sit in many spaces. There could be mixed methods case studies, there could be quantitative case studies. It kind of can suit many things. But I was really intrigued by this idea of thinking through cases. And that for me is sort of the thing that makes a case study is that you have to identify what your case is and kind of, you know, sort of think through your data that way and kind of come up with, you know, I think this is a case of. So like eventually in my dissertation, I kind of write about, well, having studied about, you know, having collected all this data around meaning making, around equity, I had to actually think through the question of like, okay, ultimately, what is this a case of? And so that's how I kind of split between case study and ethnography. But even as a kind of methodological tradition, there's a lot of overlap between the two. Yeah, so for anyone who's interested, I'm happy to kind of answer more questions around methodology. And then ultimately I had to like think about like what methods would I use? So meaning like what interviews, who would I talk to, what interviews, what would I observe? You know, what documents like made sense, and those kind of like hit at like the methods like of the study. So I'm going to stop again in case there are any questions. And I know we're almost at 10.
I have a question. This is actually a student's question, but I'm
Yay.
very curious about it. She wrote, "What were you badly surprised by any opinions and attitudes during your interviews? Meaning, was it ever tough to listen to people? Because I think an
Yeah.
ethnographer has to be has to have a certain amount of distance or maybe even empathy to
Yeah. Yeah.
take it all in and process what people are saying. Was that ever tough?"
I would say, I think yes. And then I think at some point I was in such a research mode. And I think this is one of the things that, because I was a full-time student, like in my doctoral program, I could then do my dissertation full-time. And so then I could kind of just get into researcher mode and sort of be in that mode, and sort of remove my, not that you can ever really, but you just kind of become like the researcher version of yourself, like while you're doing the interviews and such. So I would say, yes, there were certain things that I heard that I'm like, oh, I really never thought of it that way, or like, oh, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, or like, oh my goodness, like this person is works at a college, how interesting. So I think all of those things certainly showed up, and there were definitely things that people shared that, yeah, I didn't fundamentally agree with. But I think one of the things that, and I would say like my researcher training was my research training was quite strong, in that I knew that my job as a researcher at that time was to figure out, like, even if I, whether I agreed or not, that's actually not really my job. That's not even really my research question. Like, both as a researcher and for this particular study, it was to understand like why people thought that way. And I think that kind of framing that way sort of offered a little protection against some of the things that people said that I, at a personal, like as an individual, I wouldn't necessarily agree with. It's like, I'm not really going to go and have a drink with this person or like have coffee with this person afterwards, but I'm going to sit here in an interview and listen to them and hear them out and try to get some sense of, why they think the way that they do. And so that's one of the things, like, so eventually I did kind of excerpt like a piece out of my dissertation that I submitted for a journal and publication. And one of the pieces that I added, and I spent a little bit more time thinking about when I prepared the manuscript for the journal, was around something called positionality, which is pretty typical in a lot of qualitative work, especially in education. It's becoming a little more common in quantitative work, but not at the same clip or at the same depth. And that's one of the things I wrote about, because I mean, I think by the time I was doing this study, I didn't just think that equity was important. I thought racial equity in particular was really important. And so at my research site, there were some interesting dynamics around race that were happening. There were, including some people who were just like, no, I mean, like, it's socioeconomics over anything else, and all of that. And so they would say things that, yeah, I personally didn't actually agree with, but then I had to kind of recall that, what is the point of my study, and what is my point as a researcher. And again, you can survey 100 researchers and they'll come up with like all different reasons and how they might negotiate this, as well as what their orientation is, like in terms of what you believe your job and purpose is. Like, I'm just saying, like, for myself, like that's kind of how I made sense of it, and how I suppose like I was, it was kind of like okay in the end. And I just kind of thought of it as like, okay, this just gives me an opportunity to learn more and to ask more questions around, well, okay, so you said this, can you tell me a little bit more about that? I think that's sort of like one of the strategies. So it's like, oh, earlier you said that equity doesn't include blah 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 blah. Yeah, just tell me a little bit more, like, why did you say that, like what is kind of informing those thoughts. And I think that, again, that was very helpful, like both as a kind of a strategy, like just in general, but also just as a research strategy. Because again, part of, doing qualitative work, it's about getting at those nuances and the particularities. Like, it's not just about getting a yes or no answer, because I tell students this, I was like, if all you're interested in is a yes or no answer, just do a survey. Like, why would you spend like 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, maybe even 2 hours with a person, asking all you really want is like yes, no, binary. Like, the point of an interview really is to kind of, try and see the world how they see the world, so that you can then kind of take a step back and sort of interpret across a number of folks, like what might be going on around this sort of topic that is the thing that is of interest to you. So does that answer your question, or the question that the student posed on the
On the Padlet, yes, yes, it
yeah,
does. Gosh, we only have 4 minutes, but I'm
yeah.
wondering if others have questions.
Yeah, let me stop share around this. I know
Okay.
I didn't get into any of like the findings and stuff, so I'm happy to take questions around that. But yeah, I know there are also lots of questions like they're
I
on.
do have one other student question.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
sure.
Someone was wondering whether your work and research has impacted policy and outcomes.
Huh. Isn't that like, I think that's what we all hope for as like people who work in kind of education policy research.
I think all educators, right? We
I
we
mean,
want to feel like we had an impact.
yeah, exactly. And I think like we try, and that's one of the things that we try and justify around our topic, that this is policy relevant and it'll impact like the way, decision makers like think about their work and blah blah blah. Let me think. I have heard through both this project as well as through some others, um, that there were some like kind of like tangible, practical benefits. So I mentioned earlier that I did this project out in Colorado with a math department, and that project was organized around. How do I kind of explain this really quickly? Like sort of like the syllabus as an artifact for understanding how racial inequities may be sort of perpetuated. So sort of like the syllabus is like an artifact where teachers' assumptions about curriculum and course kind of factor into all of this. So when I did that project, one of the things I did provide the department chair at the end of that was like just like kind of some quick like things that I was hearing from the faculty, or some things that I was, I don't really recall the report now, but it was a couple pages. Like, I knew it shouldn't be 30 pages, but it was a couple pages. And so I wrote all this stuff down, and they didn't tell me directly, but then they told someone else who then told me that because of that report, they really did make some changes like within the department, whether around the syllabus or some other things. And I was like, oh, okay, so that's cool. So that's the sort of thing that, I mean, I think for me actually is the most satisfying, because otherwise it's like, then I'm just doing this for myself, which is fine. But ultimately, you do hope that it might make some kind of tangible difference in either another person's life or another person's work. I have heard fairly in almost every project, and again, it's not everyone I've interviewed, but that after, like kind of in the immediate aftermath of the interview, like, folks would tell me, I interview a lot of faculty that, there hasn't really been a time and a place in the space in the regular routine of work to actually think about how I teach and how I think about students, or I think about the curriculum or how I organize my work, and that the interview kind of served as that for them. So that I kind of count as some sort of impact, even though it's sort of in a raw form, but the experience of the interview did something for the participant in the way I can't even begin to understand or quantify or qualify, but that I've been told that in a number of projects. And then kind of going back to the AB 705 project I was talking about earlier, in the last round of data collection, we went back to the district officials and interviewed them. And I sort of felt like throughout that project, I was like, I feel like we're just kind of capturing things that they already know, or that people are just telling us that were happening, that, yeah, there's a lot of resistance and that there's factions. And, as a researcher, I'm like, wow, that's like super interesting. But then like when we tell them, they're like, oh, yeah, that's that person and that person and that person. So I kind of felt like, we were just sort of, just kind of collecting stuff they already knew. And it made me feel a little like, about the project, because then it's like, what's our purpose? Like, as researchers, if we're just telling you stuff you already know. But then when I did ask the district people, like when, in the final interviews, and at least one of them did say, it's like, actually, I think it probably, I mean, I don't know if this is good or bad, but they said like, those interviews actually probably gave people who may not feel heard a chance to feel heard, whether they were for or against 705 or neutral about it. So I do think that there's something in the doing of research. I think particularly if you approach the interview with care and empathy for the participant, that in itself can be an impact. And then whatever happens after that is kind of like gravy, right? And again, ideally, I think research on its own is not going to impact policy making. I think you then have to actually take a number of steps afterwards. But what the research has done is that it's made you much more fluent in what the issues are, what's at stake, so that you're then prepared to talk to a policymaker or a leader about what matters and why this matters. And frankly, it gives you legitimacy as well. So that it's like, oh, you're not just like picking a bunch of anecdotes and talking to like your close friends, that there's something about research provides a little more legitimacy to be taken seriously. So there are all these kind of things that sort of happen. But a journal article on its own, a dissertation study on its own, you need to do more after that to make it matter to other people.
That's beautiful, Cheryl. I love the idea that an interview can be as valuable for the interviewee as well as the interviewer. I
Yeah.
think, in my experience, that's very true. You've given someone a moment to reflect on what they
Mhm.
think. Sometimes you don't know what you think until you're trying to explain yourself.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
but thank you so much for taking the time to be here and just reflect on this whole journey. Super helpful. I'm sure students found it really valuable. And thank you to all who attended today. Hope everyone fills out the survey that's in the chat, and everyone have a happy Wednesday. Thanks for
All
coming.
right.
Goodbye.
Thanks for everyone.